well as a tool, to assist you in learning the material. Okay. Well, basically, we said that the Greek word arete, A-R-E-T-E, which we translate virtue, remember this is Aristotle's virtue ethics, can also be used for an inanimate thing that performs its function excellently. In other words, for Aristotle, the main points that determine what a thing is often refer to the function it is intended to serve, right? So the essential nature of a pen has to do with being an implement that enables us to write on things like paper, and the essential nature of a knife is to cut. So he says, well, could we as human beings have a central function or nature? And Aristotle thinks we are, and that we are essentially reasoning beings. Now, this may not seem to be a controversial point of view, but for some it is. At any rate, so Aristotle points out, and let me go to the next slide, because here. Oh, all right. I backed up just a tad. So basically, and we went over this last time, Aristotle says, well, our essential nature is something that's unique to us as human beings, something that sets us apart from other life forms on the earth. And he says, well, what can that be? Well, it can't be just having the basic biological functions of life. He says even plants have that, and so do non-human animals, and of course we do. So he says that cannot be what's unique to us as human beings. What about sentience? That is, having awareness of what is going on around us, having the ability to feel pleasure and pain, having a conscious life. So he says, well, here plants lose out, right? That is on everything but science fiction films. But he says non-human animals as well as us have that ability. So he says that can't be what separates us out uniquely as human beings. So he focuses on reasoning abilities, the ability to follow an argument, to understand, an abstract proof. But that he says that is our essential nature. So the point is, if virtue, the arete of the thing, is fulfilling its essential function excellently, another name for virtue here isn't just moral goodness, kind of a goody-goody two-shoes look at goodness, but it's what makes for an excellent life for a human being. So he says if we're essentially reasoning creatures, then we need to exercise our ability to reason to understand things theoretically, and those are the intellectual virtues. But he says, we need to use it to build up virtuous character traits in ourselves. So in other words, we saw that for him, the virtuous course of action is to follow, you know, the moderate mean. And how is that done? Well, by using our reason to sometimes resist what other parts of our nature would want to do. You know, to use our reason to say, well, even though I have some fear about doing so, I need to develop more courage, and one of the ways I can do that right now is to confront my boss about maybe getting a raise, right? So we don't really want to do that, but we force ourselves. Rationally, we say, you know, I need to do that. My employee, who isn't any better than I, just got a raise. I got to find out, why am I not getting one? So, you know, or you're resisting having that other piece of cake. You say, well, I need to be more, to develop more self-control in the area of, say, eating sweets or something. So what he tries to convince us of is that living what is, in his concept, a moral life, a life of high character, is also going to be the happiest life for a human. Now, as I said, I mean, we don't get this pushed at us. Often it's the opposite, right? It's the extreme life. It's a life where you're bad to the bone, you know. You know, that's the real happy life. That's the one that you're really going to have fulfillment, whereas Aristotle is saying something very different. And so he says, what is happiness? What is the purpose of being moral? What is the end of ethics? How do we define what is morally good? Well, for Plato and his theory of forms, it was in terms of an abstract standard or essence, what we call a form, the form of the good or goodness itself, that is in another realm. Now remember, I skipped over Plato's theory of forms just to kind of catch us up a little bit. But that, by the way, was what was represented by the sun outside the cave. It's confusing because the fire, since the cave represents the world our senses put us in touch with, the fire in the cave represents the sun in this world, but the sun outside the cave represents the form of the good, which enlightens every other standard for Plato. But I, you know, we're not going to go into that, and I'm not going to ask you about the form of the good. Except to say that for Plato, moral goodness is to be found in some otherworldly standard that only our reason puts us in touch with. Aristotle is much more down to earth, and he says, well, the ultimate goal of morality is to gain something that is worthwhile in and of itself. That is, the ultimate good is something that you desire because it's good in and of itself, not just because it promotes some other good. I mean, we might say, well, it's good to eat healthy foods. Why is it good to eat healthy foods? Well, if you eat healthy foods, it'll promote the good of your being, you know, basically in overall better health. And you can say, well, why is it good generally to be a healthy person? And one answer somebody could give is, well, healthy people are also happier people. This is eudaimonia. Sometimes translated happiness, but it's more than just, oh, I'm really happy today. You know, it's kind of an overall feeling of well-being and that life is going well and that I'm living a worthwhile life. And so, these things. So at any rate, Aristotle says, whatever's the ultimate good then has to be something that's pursued for its own sake. That is, eating healthy foods might promote the good of being healthier. Being healthier might promote the ultimate good of happiness, but you don't desire happiness because it leads to the production of some other good. You desire that for its own sake, in and of itself. And so this is why Aristotle puts happiness as the ultimate standard of morality, because you know, it's what we desire for its own sake. So he says, how do we live a happy life? Well, it's to act in accordance with virtue. And so virtue for him is its own reward, because for him it promotes a happier, more satisfying life than the opposite. So the happiest life is one of moderation. Virtue is walking the moderate mean between extremes. Therefore, the happiest life is the moderate life. So, question. Now, I mean, there are drawbacks to defining our humanness by rationality. You know, what about a newborn infant who can't quite reason yet? Are they fully a human being, subject, you know, entitled to all human rights? Or what about someone who has Alzheimer's at the end of the life and maybe can't reason well anymore? Are they no longer a human being then, if being a human being is tied to rationality? And of course, I mean, you know, since in our own history, you know, we had, you know, slavery as what most people today would consider an unqualified moral evil. Well, of course, in Plato and Socrates' time, slavery was simply condoned as morally acceptable, right? I mean, Meno wasn't looked upon as evil for having a slave, the one Socrates questioned about geometry, and Socrates doesn't lecture Meno on, you know, the evils of slavery. Now, it was more or less kind of understood and accepted, and maybe should have been questioned more. But Aristotle was unique in that he provided what he thought was a philosophical argument to justify slavery. And most everybody today thinks that it's a horrible argument. It's basically that if our humanness is tied up with our ability to reason, we can ask, well, are there classes of people, not just individuals within a society, but whole societies that basically are made up of more rational people than other societies? And of course, it was the Greeks who invented the word barbarian. For everybody who was not Greek was somehow below them, right? They were very elitist about this, right? You know, just because we say that a lot of good things came out of Greek philosophy, it doesn't mean that everything that came out of Greek philosophy is good or immune to criticism. And so, you know, one of the textbooks I used to use used to point out Aristotle's justification of slavery was that, well, it's just natural that a more rational people should rule over less rational group of people, and of course they thought the Greeks were the most rational of all. This also had to do with Plato and Socrates' view that reason was the most godlike part among us because it was immaterial, and the gods and Plato's forms are in this other realm, and so our reason, as opposed to what has to do with our body, you know, for Plato was the part that was most godlike. Well, you know, for Aristotle, in the natural order of things, it was simply meant that the more rational should rule over the less rational. That is, since the gods were more rational than we mere mortals, in the natural order of things, for Aristotle, the gods should rule over human beings. Well, extend that out. If it's the natural order of things that the more rational should rule over the less rational, what if the Greeks, as a group, are more rational than society X, you know, that they consider barbarians? Then the Greeks are justified in conquering them and enslaving them. And that was an argument that was used. Now remember, Aristotle, who was his star pupil? Pardon? Well, no, Aristotle was Plato's star pupil, but Aristotle was tutor to the young Alexander the Great, you know. So he didn't conquer anybody, but he certainly influenced somebody who did. Well, anyway, I'm not going to get off on this too much, but I mean, there are controversial things about tying our humanity solely to our reasoning abilities, you know, and I just want to point that out. Okay, well, what I want to do, and I don't think there's going to be enough time to play the whole thing, but I want to